People are coming in from the parking lot.
Okay, we're supposed to start, so.
I know.
We're rolling?
We're rolling.
Okay. Marlene Johnson, a dear friend of a half century, a pioneer businesswoman, a politician, a CEO of a national nonprofit, a caregiver, and the author of this wonderful book, which brings back in Technicolor a very exciting era. I wanted to set the stage a little bit for this book, and if you weren't cognizant in the 1960s and 70s, it's worthwhile to reflect on what it was like back then, because you won't be able to imagine the difference between then and now, especially when it comes to the role of women in society. In 1971, there was one woman in the Minnesota legislature. By 1972, 6 women were elected to the legislature. There was no woman on the Minnesota Supreme Court. A woman couldn't get credit without the signature of a man, and you couldn't go in the athletic club except on special occasions unless you were a guy. And one
white guy.
A white guy. Yeah, and then when Nancy Broaddus was elected to the Senate from Rochester in 1974, the ladies' room was way across the Capitol, and she went to the Rules Committee and said, I want a ladies' room closer to the chamber. And there was a big debate in the Rules Committee as to whether that was a wise expenditure of tax dollars, since there was only one woman, and who knows how long she was going to last. But she carried the day as she normally did. So, Marlene, you were on the cutting edge of a lot of that change that did come. You were a revolutionary kind of in making those changes. Well, you should describe what it was like back then to be a woman who had some ambition and wanted to get some things done.
Yes, I don't think I really understood how ambitious I was at the time, but when we started the business in 1970, my partner had a husband, and I was single, and between us we had $400. We couldn't get a loan unless she could get a loan of some kind if she had her husband's signature, but even that we didn't think we would get it. So we just started the business with $400. And her husband agreed to support her for a while, and I got a part-time job selling secondhand clothes at this little shop up by McAllister College. I don't remember the name of it anymore, but it was a cute shop. I enjoyed it, and got some retail experience. And then I worked for the St. Paul YMCA for a while, just to pay the bills until we had a cash flow. I don't think I got my first loan until the late 70s, and I borrowed money to buy the first computer. If I remember correctly, I haven't checked the archives. The archives of our business do exist at the Historical Society, but I haven't gone back to look at that detail. But I believe the computer cost $5,000.
They were expensive.
I mean, think about that. We're buying, we spend more than $5,000 to outfit an entire family with computers these days. Everybody gets their own. And we had this one big machine in the office with one person having access to it, and that person wasn't me. I got that loan with an SBA guarantee. I couldn't get a loan for myself of $5,000 in 1978 or 79. So, I mean, it was very different. And I think in some ways the only reason I even had a bank that was willing to do the paperwork to get me an SBA guarantee was because the bank was my client. We had one of our client groups. We started out serving nonprofit organizations, and then we kind of morphed to service organizations. And Minnesota is a really rich independent bank state. Not as much now, but certainly then it was a very big independent bank state. And they couldn't compete with all the gifts the big banks were giving. Those were the days when you would get a premium for opening a bank account. Remember that? Toasters and, I don't know.
Electric blankets.
Really ridiculous things. I mean, you think about it now, it's like, really? But that's what they did. And the independent banks couldn't do that. So we were helping them learn how to market their services. And and their connection to the community and, you know, the kind of stuff that community banks did, and it was really fun. But because of that, I had St. Anthony Park Bank knew me well and trusted me, and they helped me do the paperwork to get the guarantee, even though they wouldn't give me a loan on my own.
And that was a split infinitive,
Yes.
advertising.
Advertising, public relations, and general brilliance. That was our emphasis on the general brilliance, and our logo was a gold star.
There was also your involvement in various women's organizations that were part of that revolution that changed the face of Minnesota government.
Right. The first thing I did was go to a meeting of the Minnesota Women's Political Caucus. I hadn't been active yet. I was busy running the business and figuring out that piece of my life, but I was really interested in feminist politics, and I'd always been interested in politics in general from my childhood. So I went to this meeting quite naively. I didn't really know what was going on, and I came out of that meeting having been elected the chair of the state organization. And I didn't understand at the time that it had been the goal of some of the DFL feminists that the bipartisan organization was going to fold because there was no one willing to be the chair. So when people asked me to be the chair, I thought it was kind of odd, but I thought it'd be kind of fun. And so I did it, and of course I only found out much later that I was interrupting the planned failure of this organization, and it didn't fail because I really liked organizing and, you know, got on with the work of doing that. So for a while there was a bipartisan organization and also a DFL feminist caucus and a Republican feminist caucus.
Yeah. The 1960s through the 1980s, I would describe them almost as the second progressive era, nationally and locally. And in Minnesota, the Republicans had pretty much controlled the state from 1868 until 1972. The Minnesota Senate, in fact, it was exactly that long. And Senate Majority Leader Nick Coleman wanted to know what Richard Murphy had done between 1858 and 1860 to lose control for the Democrats for 114 years. So all of a sudden, the 1970s rolled around. Wendy Anderson gets elected. There's a DFL trifecta then with the governor and the House and the Senate. And a lot of things happened very fast when it came to environment, school funding, campaign finance, open government, gun control, ERA, all that. Then came Perpich Johnson, and that was kind of chapter 2 of this revolution.
Yeah, I'd just like to interrupt 1 minute,
Yeah.
because that first phase when Anderson got elected, Rudy Perpich got elected lieutenant governor at that
right.
time.
Yeah.
And at that time, those positions were separately elected. The party chose them together, so the party really forced Rudy on Wendy. Wendy did not want Rudy to be elected lieutenant governor that time, but there was a negotiation, which you know more about than I do. At any rate, the outcome was that Rudy was selected as the Democratic candidate for lieutenant governor, and he ran at the same time as Wendy, but they weren't on a ticket together as the position subsequently did. So the relationship between Wendy and Rudy did not exist during the whole time they served together. They never had one private meeting together. And Rudy wasn't involved in the administration at all. So
He was a minister without portfolio.
exactly. But he was a very popular politician.
He was that.
People
yeah.
loved him.
So chapter 2 of that kind of revolution of progressive politics was Rudy Perpich and Marlene Johnson.
Right.
And a lot of incredible things happened during that period. If you could just touch on some of the highlights.
Well, I think the first highlight was Rudy deciding he wanted a woman running mate. And he did that, I think, largely because he felt, well, he had 2 reasons. He always believed, he told me this, that he believed that he was only elected governor because he was elected lieutenant governor first. He was the first Catholic and the first non-Scandinavian ethnicity person to be elected governor. And he felt that would not have happened if he hadn't been lieutenant governor first and moved up. and filled a vacancy when Wendy moved to the Senate. And he felt the same was true for the first woman governor, that the first woman governor would need to be lieutenant governor and move up when the governor left. And he wanted to get credit for the first woman governor. So that was one thing motivating him. And second, because he'd been a really pro-woman person since he was on the Hibbing School Board, when, you know, he made sure that women could continue teaching after they got married. I mean, that was radical when he was on the school board. It's hard to comprehend that now, but it was true. At any rate, and the other thing was that in 1982, both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party had rejected female candidates for lieutenant governor. In the case of the Republicans, they had rejected Nancy Bradis. On anyone's measure, Nancy Bradis would have been an outstanding candidate for lieutenant governor, and she would have probably helped them win.
Yeah.
She was a very competent, successful business person. Anyway, and she had been in the legislature at that point for 10 years. I mean, she was a terrific person and a terrific politician. But the party couldn't, Republican Party just couldn't handle the idea of it. And in the case of the Democratic Party, Warren Spanis, bless his heart, couldn't tolerate the idea. So the party could have tolerated it, but Warren couldn't. So there you have it. So Rudy felt that if he was going to run against the party, he needed a competitive advantage, and in this environment where both parties had rejected women, having a woman on his ticket would be an advantage. I think he was proved to be correct. We only won by less than 25,000 votes, and we only spent $100,000, and the party spent $1 million. So whenever there's a piece in the book in which one of the Iron Range legislators who was not happy I was on the ticket, after we won the primary, he was in a conversation in which I had an opinion which he didn't agree with, and he said, "What the hell did you ever contribute anyway to this campaign?" And I said, 23,000 votes. And Rudy was there when I said that, and he just smiled and kept moving along in the conversation. I mean, it was really a lovely moment.
Well, you had really a unique and wonderful relationship with Rudy Perpich to begin with. I guess there's two questions here. How did you get into his orbit to begin with so he would select you? And I think you should tell this group about, he was really kind of a mentor to you. He
Yes.
wanted you to have your own budget. He wanted you to have your own portfolio. You should talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think he knew about me because I had been putting myself in front of him for a couple of years when he was governor the first time. First of all, you know, you will remember that he appointed Rosalie Wall as the first woman on the Supreme Court. And he did that in his first term in '78. And I felt that women needed to step up and thank him for that by raising some money for his reelection, for his election campaign in '78. So I held a fundraiser for women at my apartment. It was the first time I'd ever done a fundraiser. I didn't know what I was doing, except I knew who to invite, and I knew we had to ask for money, which I liked. I like asking people to part with their cash for something they believe in. So in this case, that was easy. And it turned out that Rudy hated raising money, and my little, I mean, it was truly a little fundraiser. I mean, there were 50 people there, so it wasn't so little, really, but for me, yeah, anyway. It was successful, and it was the only fundraiser in the Perpich campaign that year in which the host did the inviting, did all the food, did all the, did everything. The campaign had nothing to do except show up with the governor and first lady. So that was the first thing I did. The second thing I did was ask him to appoint me to a commission that Colin Peterson established by legislation, a small business commission that would be half legislators and half citizens. And the governor would appoint the citizens, and Colin said to me, "Go tell Rudy you want to do this, and you promise you won't make a recommendation to increase taxes, or cut taxes, rather." And so I did that, and Mark Dayton at that time was the scheduler for Perpich, And he didn't want to give me an appointment. He said, we'll give you that appointment to that commission. I know we don't have time to give you time with the governor. And I said, well, I won't accept the appointment if you don't let me talk to the governor. So they let me talk to the governor for 10 minutes. And of course, we had a half-hour conversation because nobody ever had a 10-minute conversation with Rudy. He liked to talk too much, and he liked to meet new people, and it was always fun. And then the third thing that happened was that during the campaign of '78, the World Press Institute at McAllister had 12 foreign journalists that were in town who very much wanted to meet with Rudy. They were spending the fall semester in Minnesota meeting corporate leaders and political leaders, and then they would go off running around the country at internships and things at other medias. And they couldn't get the governor's office to give them an appointment. And I was on their board, so they called me and said, could you figure out how to get us in? So I did. And of course, the governor loved it. Staff was very annoyed because he was talking to non-voters. But after 45 minutes of meeting with them, he stands up and says, Marlene, come to my office. And I go in, and he said, I have to leave in 15 minutes by King Air to fly to Wadena for a political event tonight. And I have room on the plane to take 4 people. I will take 3 of them if you're the 4th person and you take care of them. I won't take them if you can't go with them because I don't want to be responsible for these characters. So I agreed, and 3 of them, they chose which among them would go, and we went off to Wadena for a, beer and polka fundraiser, which everyone loved. And so that's how I endeared myself to Rudy Perpich. And he remembered me, and I saw him one time before he went off to Europe for control data during those interim years. And I hadn't seen him for 3.5 years when he called me to run with him.
But I thought it was interesting, he told you that all the previous lieutenant governors had, their staff was his staff. And his advice to you was to have your own independent staff.
Yes, he said, there was pressure at the legislature by, in this case, Phyllis Kahn was the leader of the pressure, to combine the 2 budgets and have the lieutenant governor office with the governor. And he said, if you want to do that, I will support it, but I would recommend that you keep your own office and have your own staff, because you'll be treated with more respect from my office, and you'll have more independence to do what you want to do when we're not giving you assignments to pick up the slack of what I need help with. And the other thing he said was, and he said this publicly in the campaign, I want the lieutenant governor to be responsible for a tourism agenda. We believe tourism is a very important economic development activity in Minnesota, and it needs to be done with more clarity and strategic approach. And we want, he said he wanted the lieutenant governor to be chair of the Open Appointments Commission, because it was his goal, which he stated from the campaign onward, that all the boards and commissions that the governor appointed would be integrated by gender and race by the end of our term. And so we published all those vacancies. Our commission actually interviewed candidates, and we gave the governor 3 to 4 candidates for every vacancy that he appointed during those 8 years. All of those groups of 3 or 4 candidates had to be diverse, had to have both men and women on them. They had all of them had to have at least one option of person of color. And by the end of our 8 terms, we had accomplished that. And by the end of our term, we had a very strong tourism agenda. And then because of my own initiative and support from the Children's Defense Fund, I took on also the children's agenda. Before I did that, I went to the governor and said, the Children's Defense Fund and others are really encouraging me to take a lead role in advancing the children's agenda. And I'd like to do that, but if I do it, I want you to officially support it, and so that I'm the one speaking for the administration on those issues. And he initially said he thought it was a mistake on my part. He would support it if I really wanted to do it, but he thought that it would be seen as a women's issue and might just detract from making a case for my leadership skills. And my view was that if one can demonstrate leadership, the public can compute that you can lead in other things too, not just the one thing you're leading on. And since nobody else would lead on children, I might as well do something that we could actually make a difference on. So in the end, that's what we did, and we were the first state in the country to have a State of the Children's speech on an annual basis, and sort of looking at what the parameters were and what the goals were and how we were making progress. So that was a pretty exciting thing for us to be doing also.
So, so in a nutshell, how did you find yourself on the gubernatorial ticket in 1982?
Well, it was, I mean, you know, for those of you who were here at the time, there was a week-long press every week, every day in the press. Laurie Sturdivant or somebody else was writing a little story about Rudy's thinking about having a woman, and they were listing all these women, Linda Berglund and Joan Grow, and they were all urban women, and I knew them all. They were all friends of mine, and I wrote in my journal, that won't help him. If he wants this to be an advantage, he'll call me. I did. It's in my journal. If you want to do the research, the journals are at the Historical Society. Anyway, so Bruce Quackenbush called me, and he had been Rudy's campaign manager in '78, and he was a lawyer, a friend of mine. He's not living in Minnesota anymore, but he called me and said, would I be willing to talk to Rudy? And I said, well, of course I will, and I know if you give him the message, I know he'll call me. And so he did tell him, and Rudy did call me, and then after I asked for a day to think about it, Bruce was one of the people who I invited to my home to help me process this. And there were two lawyers, Bruce and Jean Heilman, and there were two entrepreneurs, Karen and Leslie Desnick. And the lawyers came in and took a legal pad and put a line down the middle, pros and cons, you know how lawyers do. And so they start making the list, and they're all cons. No, they don't have anything on the pro list. They think both the lawyers are just apoplectic that I might do this. And Karen Desnick, the entrepreneur, says, "Oh, for goodness sakes, why are we spending? Why don't we just haven't you already decided you're going to do this? Why don't we just figure out how to be successful?" And I thought the two lawyers were going to lose their meal. They just couldn't believe it. They were just beside themselves that we were going to have no conversation about the cons, about why I should not do this. But they got over it, and then we spent the evening figuring out how to do it.
So Rudy Perpich, spontaneous, unconventional, mercurial, visionary.
Yep.
Talk a little bit about his character and the aspects of it that served him well and those which served him ill.
I think Rudy was a very special leader. He had a vision for things, a willingness to do things in new ways that few politicians at that point had demonstrated. Part of it was that he was always an outsider. I mean, he grew up on the range, the son of miners, and an outsider, non-Scandinavian, Catholic. You know, he just didn't think the way everybody else did. And he and his brothers had an organization on the Iron Range that made a difference, that gave John Blotnick heart murmurs. But they really cared about government. I mean, he cared about government serving people and making things better for people. He remembered things, inequities like women having to give up their jobs when they got married. He remembered inequities of domestic violence. I mean, he remembered when the miners would come home with their paycheck on Friday and beat their wives, give them the cash for the food for the next week, and then go out and drink the rest of the money on the weekend. He remembered that. He remembered seeing those bruised women sitting on their front porches. He remembered seeing Native American women left by the side of the road for dead, having been raped by white men. I mean, those images are things that he talked about in conversation that showed up in budget conversations. I mean, Tom Triplett's here, and he was in all those budget meetings that I was in, and you know, I mean, he remembered those things. They affected how he thought about things, and the fact that he had a vision for changing the makeup of boards and commissions, I mean, I don't think there was anyone else in Minnesota at that point that had thought about that. And I don't know very many states that were thinking about that either at that point in time. So he was very special. And to me personally, these private conversations that he had about things like whether I kept my office separate from the governor's office, he decided that I was going to have my own swearing in. He was going to do his in Hibbing, and he wanted me to have my own because he felt, because this was a historic moment, that it would get more visibility if I had a swearing in on my own at the state capitol. He said, you'll get your own picture on the front page of the paper, which of course is exactly what happened. So, I mean, he understood issues of symbolism as well as really changing the way things were done. And when he gave me the tourism agenda, was the first time that professional sports and the historical societies and the state parks and the professional, you know, the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra, the Walker Art Center, it was the first time that all those organizations had been in the same meeting with the hospitality industry to talk about how they were going to work together to advance a tourism strategy. I mean, it seemed, now it's yesterday's news. It's kind of a yawn. It can put everybody to sleep. But in 1982 and 3, it was happening for the first time. I mean, the first meeting I had, which I write about in the book, you know, people looked around the room and thought, who are these people? Because they'd never, it would have been, before it had been the hotels and restaurants in the room making all the decisions, doing all the thinking, and the parks people were doing their thing, but they didn't really think of themselves as part of the tourism strategy, nor did the historic sites. It was radical to think that the historic site people, which exist in every county in the country, in the state, so you know, it really changed the way we got people involved in those issues. And that was, I mean, I was the person executing on that plan, but it was Rudy's personal vision initially that influenced me and helped me create the framework for working on that.
Oh, there's a lot of qualities you have that I admire. One I've always admired is how straightforward, and when you have something to say, you serve it up directly. You don't put a lot of sugar coating on it. But you're also improvisational. And there's a story in your book that was quite charming about when you apparently discovered you had an improvisational quality. It had to do with a piano recital.
Yes. When I was the CEO of NAFSA, they would say to me, how did you learn to punt so well? Because I never got upset when things unexpected happened. And I said, well, it started out at the age of 5. My first piano recital in Braham, my hometown. We had Mr. Franklin, who was the piano teacher for the community. That's what he did. That was his first full-time job. I don't know if we have full-time piano teachers in communities anymore, but we did then, and he had 50 or 60 students. And every year he had 2 piano recitals, one in Braham at the Lutheran Church and one in Graston at the Lutheran Church. And because I was the youngest student of his, I got to play at both of them. And for the recitals, all the boys came in their little suits and ties, and the girls all wore very nice dresses that were long. And I was in good shape as a 5-year-old because I had been a flower girl twice that year. So I had a dress, a really beautiful dress my mother had made, and I'd used it for both weddings, and it was organza, and you know how they looked. And I was very excited, and I had long curls. I had red hair then. But because I was a brand new student, I had not memorized my music. The song I played was The Flight of the Bumblebee. And so I had to have my sheet music. And we were gathering in the basement of the Lutheran Church, and we were going to walk up the stairs and then down the aisle, center aisle, with Mr. Franklin leading, but I was going to be going with him, holding his hand. So he was on my right, so I'm hanging on with my right hand, and I should have been hanging on to, I was trying to hang on to the railing with the left hand, and I had my sheet music in this too. Well, you can imagine that about the fourth or fifth step, I stepped on my skirt. And it came loose. So I had to take my hand off the railing and with my sheet music and hold up the dress. I didn't want to tell him I did this. And we had to finish the walk up the stairs. Then I had to walk down the center aisle, and then I had to sit down, and then I had to get up and announce. I was the first person to play the piano, so I had to get up and announce my piece, sit at the piano, and do all that stuff without anyone knowing that I had messed up my dress. And I accomplished it, and I got home, and I walked in the door with my parents, and I burst into tears. And my parents said, "What's the matter? You did a good job." And I showed my dress. And they laughed and said, "Well, you did fine. Nobody knew, and you did a good job, so you learned something." So I always thought that was kind of when I understood that it was possible to get through crises. Nothing was that bad. You could get through it. And then when I'm a lieutenant governor, you just punt all the time, because just when you think you know what you're doing the day, the governor's office calls and asks you to do something different. And so everything changes. And, I just got used to that.
Marlene, I'm so glad you, and I know other people have felt this way too, that you included the story of your husband, Peter, how you met him, your bicontinental relationship. And the most enduring and tender part of it was your life as a caregiver for the last about 10 years of his life. Want to
Yes.
comment on that?
Yeah, it's, it was, I haven't had children, and I've never really thought of myself as a caregiver. And on the 10th of August, the 12th of August, 2010, on the early morning hours in our country house in Sweden, Peter fell down a flight of stairs. And I woke up when he landed at the bottom, and he was unconscious and was in a coma for 13 days, and ultimately wasn't able to go home and live the rest of his life in a nursing home. So it was the first time that I navigated life in Sweden without him. In our life, we met in my lieutenant governor's office in 1983. And it was an unlikely marriage by many perspectives, but we had a great time and did very well. And one of the ways we shared life was that when we were in the U.S., I was in charge of our social life and maintaining our home. And when we were in Sweden, Peter was in charge of our social life and maintaining our home there. And so I loved being in Sweden, but I'd never slept in Sweden a night by myself in the apartment. I had never, made contracts with anybody in Sweden. I mean, all those things that, come with managing a household, I hadn't done in Sweden. I had done it all here, and Peter had done it there, and it worked out fine. But then when he couldn't make those decisions, all of a sudden I had to do that myself. And also, as he, went through the hospitalization and then rehabilitation, and ultimately the decision he had to live in a nursing home and could never come home, I found myself in a situation where I had to learn how to influence the staff and still have them consider me a member of their team and Peter's team, that there could never be any tension between me and the staff if it was going to be a successful outcome for Peter. And so I learned a lot, and I came to understand as I did that even though I had in most of my life been in a leadership role different. I mean, when I was lieutenant governor, I was in a leadership role without authority. So I learned a lot about leadership by influence. When I was at NAFSA as CEO, I knew a lot about being where the buck stops, but also I had a very good management team, so I still had to build a team. But when I came to be a caregiving spouse with a husband who was in a nursing home full-time, and he couldn't speak for himself. I mean, he had some awareness, but he couldn't walk and he couldn't talk. So, and he was the only person on the ward who was in that situation. He was the youngest person in the ward when he arrived and when he left, 10 years later. Because in Sweden, nursing homes is where very elderly people go. But they were all still conscious and active and verbal, and if they got mad, they could, yell at the staff or call for help. If they could do all those things, and Peter couldn't do that. So if he needed help, it had to be that the staff would be regularly remembering to check in with him. Otherwise, he'd be isolated in his room all day by himself. So I had to learn how to motivate them to look out for him more often. And when I was with him, which I was 10 days a month, physically, I was still keeping my job in Washington, so I was going back and forth every month. When I was with him every day, I was demonstrating for them how to do that and building relationships with them. And we all became very fond of each other in a really deep way. So it was a very important experience for me personally, as well as, I think, improved the care that Peter got.
Yeah, very touching part of the book. I've just got 2 questions left here, and the first one is about what it started out, you and Rudy Perpich, as such a wonderful relationship. He was really mentoring you and working to make you successful, but something happened in the last half of the second term that changed that, and it ended when your final meeting with him after the defeat in 1990, he told you that you had not been loyal to him.
Right.
And I can't imagine you not being loyal.
Well, I was loyal to him, and the last 2 years were really hard for everybody in the administration, and including me, and including Rudy. He was suffering a personal crisis, a family crisis, and it did affect him in the way he conducted himself as governor. And I felt that in many ways I had never, ever leaked a story about the administration. A member of the cabinet could leak a story, and Rudy leaked all kinds of stories about it. I mean, whenever he wanted to get something out there or test an idea, he would, talk to Lori Sturtevant or somebody else, and there'd be a good story. I never did that. And as a result, I remember a reporter whose name will go unmentioned, but who said to me, you don't really know anything. And I mean, because I didn't leak anything, it was assumed I did not know anything. And in fact, I was involved in probably 95% of budget conversations, and I understood a lot about the budget, and I understood a lot about other things because I had access, which I describe in the book. The governor had told me at the beginning of the first transition, you can walk into my office and participate in any meeting that's on my calendar unless you're specifically told you can't. So I did, and I walked in a lot. And I didn't always plan it. I would look at his calendar in the morning and something would speak to me and I'd say, I think I want to go and hear what's going on there, or it's an opportunity for me to influence. There's somebody there I want to influence. So I would just walk down the hall. I was at the opposite wing, so it took me 5 minutes to get down there. And I'd just walk in and the governor would welcome me, introduce me to whoever was there, and meeting would go on. But those last 2 years were not fun, and I had very limited contact with the governor. And then after the election, after we lost the election, he asked me for a breakfast at the residence, and it was a bizarre breakfast because up until 2 years before, we had been very cordial all the time. There were many, many good moments, and yeah. Anyway, he said he understood I'd been disloyal, and I said that I was shocked he felt that way and really sorry that he was, because I said, I believe that not only haven't I've been loyal to you to a fault, because as a result, the press believes I don't know anything. And I believe that I have served the administration well, and I said, I am really grateful to you for this opportunity. I've worked really hard. I've enjoyed every minute of it, which was the truth. And I have a lot of respect for you, and I'm sorry that you feel let down. So that was the last time I talked to Rudy Perpich. And it was a very, very sad moment, because I really loved the man, and I appreciated very, very much the opportunity, and I felt really good about what I had contributed and what he had accomplished. The administration did a lot of really good things.
So my last question, that's a perfect lead into it. What are you most proud of from your 8 years as Lieutenant Governor?
I think I'm very proud of the appointments he made, both the ones that I helped him make, as well as the judiciary appointments. I think there wasn't a governor in the country that did better. And when I look now, we put the first Dr. Cassius on the medical board. Now, the medical examiner's board is half non-white, for goodness sakes. And, women judges are a common occurrence, and the Supreme Court has several women, and, it's just...
At times a majority.
Exactly. I mean, it's just wonderful, and I think it happened because of the leadership of Rudy Perpich and putting a line in the sand. The Open Appointments Commission, I believe, is by state law now, isn't that? Somebody can help me with it, but when he did it, it was executive order, but I believe it became a law after that. And I'm very proud of the children's agenda, because even though there's so far to go, we made strides and we made it important, and I think that it has continued to be important. I think Carlson maintained a lot of that, and certainly Dayton and Walls have advanced the children's agenda a lot in Minnesota. So the tourism, it's kind of a ho-hum. Everybody, it's not a question anymore. It's very good, and the bike system in this country, we were doing lieutenant governor's bike rides that were radical. I mean, these, and now the bike trails in this state are so extraordinary that it just I can hardly believe it. It's just fantastic. So I just feel really good that I was playing a small role at a time when we just kind of opened up some of those doors, and they've just stayed open.
Yeah, it's a great time to be there, to be alive there.
Yeah.
So do we have time for questions and answers? Yeah, okay. So any questions?
I have the microphone, I'll pass. I'd like to start out. So you mentioned the part where you're going into these meetings that you're not necessarily invited to, I suppose, but could be beneficial for you as well. And is walking into a room that you're maybe not receiving an invitation for, was that something that has always come naturally to you, or what is that moment like right before you walk into that room?
Nobody's asked that question before. Well, I don't think I would have thought about it if the governor had not specifically told me I was welcome. He told me that when he was lieutenant governor, he never had one private meeting with Wendell Anderson. And he wanted his administration to be completely different. He wanted a lieutenant governor who had open access. So, I guess all I did was try it the first time, and it worked, so I just kept doing it. Yeah.
Well, there's a twist to that, too, because he didn't invite his staff to a lot of those meetings, so you...
That's also true. Rudy most politicians like to have staff around to take notes and to keep them from making mistakes. Rudy had no problem making a mistake, or he was just, if things didn't go well, he would just redo it. I mean, he's the ultimate action learning person, because at the core of action learning, which is a methodology that's taught in higher education, it is that you try something, and if it doesn't work, you try something else. And Rudy did not know that was a methodology, but he did it all the time. I mean, am I not right, Tom Triplett?
That's right.
Yes, I mean, it was just at his core, he was not afraid to be wrong. Yeah.
And that, if I might throw, those last 2 years that you were talking about, that began to shift.
Exactly.
And that's one of the main reasons that all of us left eventually in those final 2 years.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the last 2 years were different. He kind of lost his way.
Hi, Marlene. We still don't have a woman governor in Minnesota, and I'm not certain why.
Well, we will. Well, I mean,
Yeah, that's right.
let's
We will.
let's just say that I think Rudy is proven right, that we had a candidate who was completely qualified to be governor. She was. I mean, she should have been. She'd been Speaker of the House. I mean, nobody could be more qualified than she. She didn't get elected, and Rudy's view was that the Minnesota parties and in that case it was the party accepted her, but the public wasn't ready, that it required somebody to be lieutenant governor and move up when there's a vacancy. So I think when we get our first woman governor, when Governor Flanagan is sworn in, Rudy Perpich will have his view on this will be affirmed.
And we'll finally get a female president too, on top of that.
In the same way.
Any-
And I think that's also the case. And what I said the other day in another conversation about the book is that, in Washington, well, also in Minnesota, it is kind of everyone's favorite view to complain about how lieutenant governors and vice presidents don't get enough visibility. And my view is that the number one job for the number two person is to be prepared to be number one. And it's not to get on the front page of the newspaper all the time. It's to be prepared. And in the book, I share that Martha Griffith was one of the mentors I had when I was lieutenant governor. She was lieutenant governor of Michigan, but before that, she'd been a congresswoman from Michigan for 20 years. She would have, if she'd stayed in Congress, she would have been the first female chairman of appropriations. But because her husband was ill, she wanted to go back to Michigan. She said to me, I met her the first time I went to a national lieutenant governor's meeting, and we became pals. And when she learned what kind of access I had to the governor's meetings and staff, she said, "You're in the strongest position of any of us, so just use it. And every time you're in a meeting, take notes, not because your notes are important to the governor, but you need to think about how you would make the decision if it was different than his. Not because you're better or worse than him. And if you disagree with him, you should share it with him privately, but it's not to do that. It's for you to think about the work of being governor." And so I took her advice, and I did that all the time. And she said to me, "Refresh your plan every month or so about who will be in your cabinet if you're governor tomorrow. You'll keep probably half of them, and some of them you won't, and you'll have your own people. And you just always be refreshing in your head how you would do this job." And I think that the current lieutenant governor has been doing that as well. And I think the current vice president has clearly been doing that. I mean, the fact that this transition has been as flawless as it has reflects a person who is very well prepared. And that's the job she has. So it doesn't matter that she hasn't been on the front page of the paper. It matters that she's prepared.
You've talked about mentorship, and you talked a little bit about your experience in higher education. Can you discuss more the importance of mentorship in bringing the next generation forward, being active, understanding how to get things done, and maybe a little bit more about who important mentors have been in your life?
Yeah. I think that most of us have opportunities to mentor that we don't even notice. I mean, mentorship, in my case, my mentors were not linear because I didn't have a linear growth. You know, for those of you who have read Catherine Bateson, who's Margaret Mead's daughter, she wrote a book called Composing a Life, which really, when she wrote it, it was about women who didn't move up the ladder but had jobs, you know, like a patchwork quilt, different experiences, and they came to, you know, they helped you become who you were. And that's, I mean, my life is kind of a mess. You know, it's just all these different things. And the first mentor that I remember, who I write about in the book, was Paralee Milligan, who was an African-American woman who was the first head of the employment program for Ramsey County Citizens Committee for Economic Opportunity. And I had an internship with her when I was a student at Mac. And oh my goodness, I still remember, it was just transformational for me. First of all, she was a college-educated person, but this was the first professional position she'd ever held. She was probably in her late 40s by then. And because there were no jobs for black women who were well-educated. So she was doing factory work up until she got this job. And she was, you know, at that time, factory work that she had was piecework. So you got paid by the piece, but you were not, there was a limit to how many pieces you were supposed to do because they didn't want to pay you more than so much. So, and she was capable of working much faster than everybody else because she figured out some, but she had to slow down. So she had to take longer breaks and all these other things just so she didn't put other people out. And but I knew her story because she spent lots of time with me privately, but also I observed her. I observed her working with the people who were in our organization, coming to the office looking for jobs. I observed her talking to employers. My job was to find out who with the employers were the right person for her to talk to, and then I would listen to her telephone conversations with them, or sometimes they would come to the office and I would watch it. It was just an extraordinary experience for me on so many levels. I had lots of contact with the people looking for jobs, but I had also this incredible experience with her personally, and we stayed close until she passed. And so there were a couple other women like that who really helped me, that were because of they weren't in my organization because I was an entrepreneur once I left college, and so I didn't have those kind of things. And then when I started, Diane Ahrens, who was on the Ramsey County board, the first woman on the Ramsey County board, she got me my first one of my first community boards on the Landmark Center, where I met Betty Musser, who was just an amazing person, and became my big supporter and guide in how to make it through a whole bunch of things in the community. And John Myers, who was the retired chairman of Champion Paper, I would have had no contact with him at all except for this board. But he latched on to me and liked what I was doing, and he became my pal. And Tom Swain also. Tom is still around at the age of 103. So you just never know. I mean, for those of us for people who need the mentoring, we have as much responsibility for getting that help as the mentors have for giving it to us. But it comes it comes in different ways. It comes, if I didn't know I was going to get mentored by going on the Landmark Center board, but once I was there and realized there were a couple of people showing a little bit of interest to me, I glommed on, because I was getting help of all, different kinds of help from each person. And it was just wonderful, and, it helped me a lot. So, you just never know where those kind of moments of support are going to be from.
It looks like there's about 3 minutes left, and I think it'd be interesting if you could tell how it is Gorbachev came to Minnesota and the improvisation you came up with.
Yes. You may remember that in 1990, Gorbachev announced that he was coming to the United States and he was going to visit places outside of Washington. So within days, Governor Perpich announced to the Minnesota Press Corps that he was going to invite Gorbachev to Minnesota. And the press just guffawed, and the politicians guffawed, and it was another one of crazy Rudy's ideas. And so in that period, a week or two in that period, I was at a dinner party at Marilyn Carlson Nelson's home. Marilyn was ultimately the CEO of Carlson Companies. And we'd been friends for a long time. But I was there as lieutenant governor, and I don't remember the purpose of the dinner party except that there were maybe 50 people there, and Whitney McMillan was there, who was CEO of Cargill at the time. But he was not sitting at my round table, but at some point during the meal, he comes over to me, taps me on the shoulder, and said, "I need to talk to you in the other room." So I get up, excuse myself, go to the other room with Whitney, and he said, I need to say to you that I think Rudy's invitation to Gorbachev is the right thing to do. It's just fantastic, and I want you to tell Rudy that I think so, and that he shouldn't worry about what the press says because they're wrong, and that next week I'm going to be in Moscow and I'm going to be meeting with Gorbachev. So I'm going to tell him to accept Perpich's invitation. So I said, I'll be happy to deliver this message to the governor. So the next day I went to the office, and first thing there, and told him, and Rudy looked at Terry Montgomery and he said, "Well, I guess we better start planning because we know it's going to happen." So everybody's excited now. They soon know that Gorbachev is coming, and Rudy goes back to his secretive self, and he's not telling anybody who's going to be meeting with Gorbachev, including me. But I mean, I'm used to not knowing the secret, so I don't know. And then finally I'm told that Joan Grow and Walter Mondale and I are going to greet him at the airport, so I've got a job for that day. But everybody else in town is just hysterical. I mean, the political friends of Perpich are just beside themselves because they all want to be seeing Gorbachev, and Rudy's keeping the guest list a secret, and since they're not invited, they know they're not on it. And the congressional delegation, they're not on it, and they're upset too. And so I'm talking to Carol Pharisee, who was my fundraiser and a dear friend. And I said, we got to come up with something because everybody's hysterical and they're calling our office like we're supposed to be able to fix this. And I mean, there's just not a conversation between us and the governor's office on this subject. Clearly, Rudy has decided it's going to be a secret. So we decided to rent the AAUW house that's right next door to the governor's residence. And Carol and I raised a little bit of money and made a guest list, and we organized a caterer to have lunch, and the guest list included the Minnesota delegation and a bunch of political friends and other people that we thought, I don't know, it was 150 people or something, I don't know how many, I forget. And so we had invited them to hang out together in honor of in honor of President Gorbachev's visit. I mean, it's so ridiculous when you think about it, but I thought it was a great idea. And so this is typical Marlene, I have to say. And so we have this, everybody's gathered and everybody's in a good mood at our at this women's house, and once everyone's seated and I've made a little speech and they're all talking among themselves, and Dernberger's there, and who's the other senator?
Boschwitz.
Boschwitz, I just forgot, sorry. And the whole congressional delegate, everybody's there, everybody's having a good time. And so I send a message, handwritten message, on Lieutenant Governor's letterhead with the security detail to President Gorbachev next door, and ask him, say that we've got all the congressional delegation here and other friends of Minnesota, and they would love to say hello to the president if he's got time to stop over. And and the security goes over there and delivers the message, and then, I don't know, 10 minutes later they come back and say that there will be a reception line for our guests in front of the governor's residence in about half an hour or something. So Gorbachev and Perpich and Mrs. Gorbachev, they went out and stood in the front lawn, and we took these people over to shake hands, and everybody was happy.
Even the governor.
Even the governor. I mean, he never said anything negative to me about it, and obviously he made it happen. He would have had to make it happen, because it wouldn't have happened without his support. But he never spoke to me about it. But we were happy, and in the archives are all these sweet notes from people thanking me for having done this.
Our time is up, but this is a great book, and I highly recommend it.
Thank you very much for being here.
And you're going to sign some books.
Yes, absolutely.
If you'd be interested in a book, just come see us at the front.
I'll go out there and so I can sign them. Yeah, absolutely.